women to major in engineering. The thing that temporarily changed that was World War II. World War II temporarily weakened these gendered assumptions of what was proper or improper for women, and it opened more opportunities for women to cross over to traditionally male work like engineering. And the reason for that is World War II. Men were being drafted. Men were being called into the military, called to Washington. There was a manpower shortage. You've probably heard of Rosie the Riveter, how assembly lines were trying to turn out planes and tanks and ammunition for the war effort, but they were short on male workers. So they did something they never would have done during peacetime. They hired women to work on the assembly line. So the history of Rosie the Riveter is pretty well known now, women working on assembly lines during World War II. But what a lot of people don't realize is that industry was also short of engineers during World War II. Again, the men were being drafted. They needed more help to keep the factories running 24/7. So World War II, the military factories, they come to the colleges and say, we want to employ women engineers. And the colleges say, yeah, we don't have a lot of those. So during World War II, the federal government set up a crash program to train women in engineering. They offered free classes in chemistry, math, and engineering for students to upgrade their skills. So, for instance, if you were a bright high school student, you could take these special wartime classes that would sort of prepare you extra fast for a wartime job. And in 1943, 15 colleges opened these special classes to teach engineering to women. But that was still too slow for a lot of the companies that were trying to produce material for the war effort. One of those was the Curtiss-Wright Airplane Company. They were turning out airplanes, fighters, bombers that were needed to fight, and they needed engineering help. They wanted women engineers. So they figured since the colleges weren't graduating them fast enough, Curtiss-Wright said, sorry, Curtiss-Wright said, let's set up a special training program. Curtiss-Wright put these ads in college newspapers. You can see at the bottom left, it said, if you're a female college student here during World War II, we want to give you an opportunity to participate in the war effort by becoming a Curtiss engineering cadet. They surrounded by all this patriotic rhetoric. As a Curtiss-Wright cadet, you'll be a co-worker with a soldier. This is your opportunity to give our valiant men the weapons to save America. So they wanted to give 700 women special engineering training. The Curtiss-Wright Company enlisted 7 colleges, most of them public land-grant schools, to give this special wartime training to women. So take a look at the list here. Cornell, Penn State, Purdue, Minnesota. There's our own Iowa State, Texas, and Rensselaer Polytechnic. The idea was each of these schools was supposed to train about 100 women in engineering so they could go work for Curtiss-Wright to help win the war. So here's the issue of the Iowa State Daily announcing this new program. Look at that big, bold headline. Train women here. College will train co-eds for work in airplane engineering. Again, Iowa State had had female students all along, but mostly they were majoring to become teachers, they were majoring in home economics or in the liberal arts. You had 1 or 2 at a time in engineering, but now all of a sudden during World War II, they're saying, we're going to train 100 women in aeronautical engineering. That's exactly what they did. At each of these 7 schools, they gave the women a 10-month sped-up immersion course in aeronautical engineering. Here's the list of courses they put them through: engineering math, job terminology, aircraft drawing, engineering mechanics, aircraft materials, theory of flight, aircraft production. They used exactly the same textbooks as the regular engineering classes. Here's the curriculum for aircraft materials. You can see they've got materials testing, tension testing, compression testing. They learn about the airplane parts. They do wind tunnel testing. So it was a very intense, very rigorous engineering curriculum. It was just speeded up, and it was being taught exclusively to women to prepare them to help win the war. So it was an adjustment for the professors because before now they were used to having classes of men only. At the University of Minnesota, they talked about a reputedly tough engineering professor who walked into his first Curtis Wright class and suddenly burst into uncontrollable laughter, eventually recovering to admit he had never before faced 25 females wielding slide rules. He'd literally never seen an engineering class with women before. But a lot of the engineering professors admitted that they were pleasantly surprised by how well the female students were doing. One Iowa State teacher said, in comparison to men engineers in the same length of time, the girls are stacking up pretty well. At Penn State, one-third of the women in these special engineering classes got grades high enough to make the dean's list. And it was great publicity. Life magazine actually ran a special feature. You did get the inevitable. Take a look at the headlines here. Cadets invade campus, women invade RPI campus. So there's still that sense that engineering was for men only, that these women were doing something unusual, but they justified it through patriotism. You can see the drawings here. Here's this woman walking arm in arm with Uncle Sam. Her arm is full of engineering equipment and blueprints. Here's this cadet on the right who drew a picture of herself practically wrapped in the American flag. So they said, yes, we're doing something unusual. We're women studying engineering, but we're doing it to help win the war. And these women finished the training, and most of them did go to work in Curtis Wright factories, helped building airplanes in 1944. Okay, so World War II set up these special opportunities for these women to have special accelerated training in engineering. There was also something unusual that happened at Iowa State during World War II. Back in 1929, Iowa State's Home Economics College had set up this country's first major in household equipment. They said the modern period in which we live is an age of machinery. So they said modern housewives, modern wives and mothers need to know how to learn how to handle the latest electric stoves, the latest gas refrigerators. They need to understand not just how to use them, they need to know how they work. They need to know how to fix them if they get broken. So Iowa State majors in household equipment in home economics. They took 9 hours worth of classes in equipment mechanics, where they literally dismantled refrigerators to learn how they worked. They took not 1, not 2, but 3 physics classes. They took classes on home lighting and refrigeration. They inspected construction sites. They planned out a whole home heating and cooling system. So they were home economics majors, but they were studying the latest technology in domestic equipment. Well, when World War II came along, and these companies like Curtis Wright and General Electric said, we want to hire women engineers, Iowa State said, well, they're not technically engineers, they're home economics majors, but they know physics, they know technology. And sure enough, General Electric, Western Electric, General Motors hired a bunch of Iowa State home ex-students to do wartime testing work and design. They did things like calibrating military instruments. They tested radio transmitters and receivers. They tested airplane motors. They knew they were doing something unusual. They were women going into engineering and technology that everybody assumed was male knowledge. But one of these women, Patricia Traylor, was proud that she could keep up with the expectations. She said, I made those test engineers swallow their guffaws about home ec majors. I was certainly glad I had physics and household equipment mechanics. So they trained in home economics, but during World War II, these women were in demand for technical work. Also during World War II, in part because it was suddenly seen as important for women to know engineering, the number of women pursuing engineering degrees took a real jump during wartime. At Purdue in 1944, they had over 30 women studying for engineering degrees. By the next year, 1945, that had more than doubled. They suddenly had 75 women going for engineering degrees. Here at Iowa State, we're a little bit behind. Take a look at the headline here. 5 women are now enrolled in Iowa State engineering. But that was seen as newsworthy, having 5 women studying engineering at Iowa State. So, women crossing over to study traditionally male engineering during World War II. What about going the other way? What about men studying home economics? Well, that started again a little bit before World War II, again at land grant schools. Again, everybody assumed that the men were supposed to be there studying agriculture and engineering, but there was nothing physically preventing them from walking over to the home ec classroom. And in the 1930s, Iowa State actually offered a special course in home economics just for men. According to the catalog, it was cooking adapted to forestry, engineering, scout camps, and fraternity houses. So the idea was that men, while they were doing these typical male things, might find it useful to learn a little bit about cooking. So if you were out in the middle of a forest, running a lumbering camp, you would need to know how to cook over a fire. Or if you were in charge of running a fraternity house, you would need to supervise the kitchen. And they also said it didn't hurt for men to know a little bit about cooking who could survive if they were ever put on their own. So the idea was, maybe you're a husband and your wife's gone away to visit her mother for a week. You want to be able to feed yourself. So Iowa State offered a home ec class just for men. Okay, that's just one class, right? But it was actually pretty rigorous. This is the menu for the final dinner. They required the men to cook. Take a look at it. I don't know, I'd have trouble doing some of that. The jellied vegetable lime salad sounds pretty blah, right? But the peanut brittle ice cream, I could definitely go for that. One place that took training men in home economics a little more seriously was Cornell. Not just any home economics, they actually created a degree program in hospitality management, what they called the Cornell Society of Hotel Men. And notice that word, hotel men. They envisioned hospitality management as being a part of the Cornell Home Economics College that was just for men. These were men who were going to go run hotels. So they said they need to have professional knowledge of things like institutional management or corporate finance. But in order to run a hotel, they also need to know something about food preparation. They need to know how to care for the sheets and towels. They need to know how to decorate the place. They need to know how a kitchen and laundry should run. So these men in the Cornell Hospitality Management Program, they took some classes in what they called hotel engineering. You can see them here working with the steam boilers. How does a hotel heating system work? How do the elevators work? How do the plumbing work? But then later that afternoon, they go over to the home ec side of the Cornell campus, and they're there taking cooking classes. They're learning nutrition. They're practicing cooking. The idea is they need to know both sides to run a hotel. One little fun footnote is that apparently for some reason, a bunch of Cornell's football team in the 1930s decided to major in hotel management. Actually, 14 starters on the 1939 Cornell football team, which was unbeaten first in the country, were majors in hospitality. And so there was kind of a fun report in one of the articles about this football team, how successful they were. Never in the annals of football has their opponent, a Big Ten champion, been defeated by a team, Cornell. 2/3 of the players were enrolled in the College of Home Economics. So it's kind of fun the way they're playing there with stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, home economics, and football. World War II, just as it opened opportunities for women to go into engineering, it also opened some opportunities for men to study home economics. Specifically, during World War II, Iowa State ran some special training programs for the Navy. They brought men to Ames to study electrical engineering. They brought them to Ames to learn diesel mechanics. But the home economics class at Iowa State, the female faculty set up special classes for Navy men. They taught almost 300 men how to become cooks and bakers on submarines and aircraft carriers and troop transport ships. So these men were in the home economics classes, working in the same kitchens, learning the same cooking classes as the women students, but the idea was they were going to be cooking in an all-male environment, a wartime submarine or aircraft carrier. Okay, let's pause here for a minute. So we've been talking about women going into engineering and men going into home economics. That raised some pretty serious issues. Discrimination. Nobody expected them there. They were relatively few. Even some of the professors didn't want them there. As we said, we've got no way to ever tell how many women over the years were steered out of engineering. And we don't know how many men might have wanted to major in home economics, but were steered away. Maybe their family pressured them to do something that was more predictable. Maybe their friends made fun of them. Maybe their faculty or advisors discouraged them. Maybe administrators discouraged them. There's no way to really count that. Something that's interesting is women in engineering and men in home economics had parallel complaints. The handful of women who went into engineering early on looked around the engineering building and said, hey, there are no bathrooms for women. They expected all the students and faculty to be men. Why would they have bathrooms for women? And the male students who went over to take home economics classes, they looked around and said, hey, there are no bathrooms for men in these home economics buildings. They assumed they only needed bathrooms for women. So kind of a problem when you've got to go. For the female students in engineering and the male students in home economics, some of them unfortunately encountered professors who weren't really welcoming, professors who thought it was inappropriate to have women studying engineering and inappropriate to have men studying home economics, and actual discrimination. In the 1930s, there was one male student at Kansas State University who went into home economics, declared a major, took all the classes, filled all the requirements, and then Kansas State said, no, we're not giving you a diploma. We know you met all the requirements, but we're just not giving a diploma in home economics to a man. They finally apologized and gave him his degree 40 years later. Okay, coming up to the end of the story here. What happened after World War II? Immediately after World War II, there was a backlash against women in engineering. When war was over, a lot of people wanted to go back to conservative gender roles. There was a real push to get women out of male jobs so the jobs could go to veterans who were looking for work. The GI Bill brought a lot of men to college in the years immediately after the war, and that meant that they literally didn't have room for women in a lot of classes. Even if women had wanted to go into engineering, sometimes they said, sorry, we've got too many male veterans here. We don't have room for you. There was still an assumption that engineering really was a masculine field. Take a look at this headline here. It says it all. The assumption women are not for engineering. The person who wrote that article in the 1950s, that was the dean of engineering at Penn State University. And he said flatly, women lack the basic capabilities for engineering, and no employer is going to want to hire a woman engineer now that the war is over. So there was a lot of discouragement. Nevertheless, over the decades, the number of women in engineering did continue to grow despite that discouragement. 1949, across the entire country, if you look at all colleges and universities, Iowa State, Purdue, Ohio State, California, everywhere else, total of 763 women enrolled in engineering. Think about it. 763 female engineering students in the entire country in 1949. That's less than we have just at Iowa State in any one year now. But then by 1957, less than a decade later, that had more than doubled.